Hi, I'm Bonnie Dalaroy. For my Girl Scout Gold Award project, I'll show you how to compost with worms. Worm composting or vermiculture uses worms to decompose kitchen scraps and produce rich fertilizer. Basically, it's recycling. Worm composting is the fastest composting method. It reduces household garbage disposal costs, produces less odor, and attracts fewer pests than putting food directly into a garbage container. It saves the water and electricity that kitchen sink garbage disposal units consume, saves space in country landfills, and produces free, high-quality soil used for gardening. And finally, worm composting requires little space, labor, or maintenance. A sturdy wooden box is great for outdoor use because it keeps the worm relatively cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. The pores in wood will also keep the box well ventilated and never too soggy. A plastic box is good for indoor use because it is relatively clean and leakage-free. Just be sure to drill 1/4-inch holes in the bottom and sides of your bin to provide drainage and ventilation. Your worms may also drown if it gets too wet in the compost bin. For the layered design, simply stack 2 or more boxes on top of each other. Drill holes on the bottom of each box to allow the worms to crawl upwards once you're ready to harvest the castings in the lower box. This design is convenient for people who do not wish to manually harvest the compost later on. Of course, environmentalism is all about reusing, so feel free to fashion your own container from any material at hand, such as a basket covered with a piece of cloth or even an old fish tank. Keep in mind that containers should be relatively shallow because worms like to feed near the surface where they can breathe. It should be irrigated since worm must be kept moist but not too wet. Ventilated because worms need to breathe too. And finally, the container should be able to keep out excessive sunlight. Also, place your compost bin in a dark, quiet, and well-ventilated environment where your worms can live in peace. Good locations include a laundry room, garage, balcony, kitchen sink cabinet, or shaded area outside. For the bedding, you can use materials such as hay, peat moss, newspaper strips, and cardboard strips. Machine shredded paper is the best source for bedding material since they're readily available in most office buildings, schools, libraries, and other locations. Rather than have these paper wastes sent to local landfills, why not use them for your worm bedding? To prepare the paper strips, rip paper into approximately 1-inch strips and moisten them in water. Test out the moisture level by squeezing the strips in your fist. If only 1 drop of water appears, then they're ready to be used for bedding. For cardboard strips, soak the cardboard in water and apply the same test. Fill your compost box up to 2/3 with your bedding material and fluff it up to create air spaces that will later control the odor and also allow worm space to move. Finally, throw in some grit like dirt or coffee ground that will help worms grind up and digest their food. Red worms are best for composting food, but many types of composting worms are available at your local flower and bird market or fishing equipment store. When communicating with a Chinese vendor, simply indicate that you want to use your worms to produce fertilizer. Another way is to travel to a worm cultivation site, like I did, and get your worms for just 15 RMB per pound. 1 pound of worm is usually between 800 and 1,200 worms, depending on their size. Usually, 2 pounds of worms is enough to start off a bin for a family of 4. An adult worm lays around 3 cocoons every 2 weeks, and each cocoon will contain around 3 baby worms. This means your worm population can easily double in a month. Worms are most comfortable between 10 to 21 degrees Celsius. A lower temperature would result in the worms feeding and reproducing slower. Also note that when you first place your worms in your bin, do not feed them for the first week and let them get used to their new home. Worms can eat their own body weight, but a better ratio would be 1 pound of food waste for 2 pounds of worms per day. It is recommended that you feed your worms weekly at small amounts rather than dumping a whole lot of food in at one go. Observe how long it takes your worms to finish their meals and adjust accordingly. When your compost pile is too wet, mix in some dry bedding or drill in more holes. If your bin is producing an odor or attracting pests, fluff up the bedding more, bury the food into the bedding, put in less food until the worms finish up their meals, or avoid putting in rotten food. Also, place a cover on top. If your worms are dying or crawling away, it could be because your bin is too wet, too dry, exposed to extreme temperatures, not well ventilated, or because you are underfeeding your worms. Adjust accordingly. When all bedding materials are consumed, it is time to collect your compost. The first method is to move all contents to one side and add in new bedding on the other. Add some dirt in the new bedding and start feeding there. When the worms crawl to the new side, harvest the compost. The second method is to place the compost bin in the sunlight for around an hour and allow the worms to burrow downwards and away from the light. Harvest the top layer of compost and add in new bedding. The third method is to simply dump all contents on a piece of newspaper and pick out the worms manually. And finally, the fourth method accommodates the layered design. When the bottom bin is ready to be harvested, place new bedding material in the top bin situated directly on the compost surface of the bottom bin. Bury your food scraps in the top bin, and in 1 or 2 months, most of the worms will have moved to the top in search of food. Now the bottom box will be relatively worm-free and ready to be harvested. Worms can produce their own weight in casting per day. Dilute this rich fertilizer by mixing in some normal dirt and it will be ready to nourish your plants. You can even start your own organic garden at home.